The wind howled across the Montana plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it secrets that the Dutton Ranch had buried for generations. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about Rip Wheeler, the man who wore loyalty like armor but carried scars deeper than the Grand Canyon itself. This isn't just another story about cowboys and conflict. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about a moment that nearly tore apart the most powerful family in television history, and the woman who became the catalyst for Rip's most shocking decision. Stay with me until the very end, because what happened behind those cameras will leave you questioning everything you witnessed on screen. The day started like any other on the Yellowstone set, with the crisp morning air biting at exposed skin and the crew huddled around steaming cups of coffee, their breath creating small clouds in the freezing temperature. Cole Hauser arrived before dawn, as he always did, his method-acting process requiring him to inhabit Rip Wheeler's headspace long before the cameras started rolling. But something was different that morning. The script pages he clutched in his weathered hands contained dialogue and action that made even the seasoned actor pause. The scene called for Rip to confront a Native American woman caught trespassing on Dutton land, but what the script demanded went far beyond a simple confrontation. It required Rip to physically restrain her, to drag her across the frozen ground, to embody a level of aggression that walked a razor-thin line between protective violence and something far more troubling. Taylor Sheridan, the mastermind behind Yellowstone's brutal authenticity, had written the scene with specific intention. He wanted to show that even the most beloved characters exist in shades of gray, that loyalty to family sometimes demanded actions that couldn't be justified by simple morality. Rip Wheeler had become a fan favorite precisely because of his unwavering devotion to John Dutton and his fierce protection of Beth, but Sheridan understood that real people, even fictional ones worth caring about, sometimes do things that make us uncomfortable. This scene was designed to test the audience's allegiance, to force viewers to confront their own willingness to excuse violence when it came from someone they loved. The woman in the scene, played by Tanaya Beatty, represented something more than just an individual trespasser. She symbolized the centuries-old conflict between settlers and indigenous people, between those who claimed ownership of land and those who had walked it long before property lines were drawn. Cole Hauser spent the hour before shooting in his trailer, wrestling with the scene's implications. He had received hundreds of messages from fans who saw Rip as the moral center of the show, the one character whose actions, however violent, always served a greater good. This scene threatened to complicate that perception. He thought about his own daughters, about how he would want them to be treated if they found themselves in a vulnerable position. He thought about the responsibility that came with portraying masculine strength on screen, how easily it could be misinterpreted as permission for real-world aggression. But he also trusted Taylor Sheridan's vision, understood that storytelling sometimes required uncomfortable moments to reveal deeper truths. Rip Wheeler wasn't meant to be perfect, he was meant to be real, and real people make choices that haunt them. The actress, Tanaya, had her own reservations about the scene. She had read the script with growing unease, recognizing the historical weight her character carried. Native women had been subjected to violence and exploitation throughout American history, their stories often relegated to footnotes or ignored entirely. Playing a victim in this context felt fraught with potential problems. Could the scene be shot in a way that honored the reality of that violence without exploiting it? Would audiences understand the critique embedded in the confrontation, or would they simply see another indigenous person being brutalized for dramatic effect? She had requested a meeting with Taylor Sheridan before agreeing to film the scene, needing to understand his intentions and ensure that her character wouldn't be reduced to a mere prop in Rip's character development. That conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, with Taylor explaining his vision for the scene and the larger narrative arc it served. He spoke about the Dutton family's complicated relationship with the Broken Rock Reservation, about how the show deliberately portrayed the moral ambiguity of land ownership and legacy. This scene, he argued, was meant to make the audience uncomfortable, to force them to see Rip's actions through a critical lens rather than simply accepting them as justified protection of his adopted family. Tanaya listened carefully, asking pointed questions about how the scene would be edited, what dialogue would follow, whether her character would be given agency beyond being a victim. Taylor assured her that this moment would resonate throughout future episodes, that the woman's identity and story would matter beyond this single confrontation. Satisfied but still cautious, she agreed to move forward, with the understanding that she could stop filming at any point if it felt exploitative or dangerous. The cinematographer, Ben Richardson, had his own concerns about how to shoot the scene. He understood that camera angles could completely change the meaning of what audiences saw. A low angle that made Rip look towering and powerful would create a different emotional response than an eye-level shot that emphasized the fear in the woman's face. He decided on an approach that would force viewers to witness the violence without glorifying it, keeping the camera at a middle distance that captured both characters' full bodies and the harsh landscape surrounding them. The snow-covered ground would show the physical trail of the confrontation, making it impossible to ignore the force Rip used. There would be no dramatic music, no editing tricks to make the violence seem heroic or justified. Just the sound of breathing, struggling, and the wind carrying away any words that might have explained or excused what was happening. When the crew finally assembled for the scene, an unusual tension hung over the set. The stunt coordinator went through the choreography 3 times, ensuring that every movement would be safe for both actors while still appearing convincingly rough. Hauser and Tanaya practiced the physical sequence slowly, establishing clear communication about what would happen and when. Cole would grab her arm and pull her away from the boundary line she had crossed, his grip firm but carefully controlled to avoid actual injury. She would resist, her body weight pulling against him as she tried to break free, creating the visual of a violent struggle without anyone actually being hurt. They would fall into the snow together, and Cole would pin her there momentarily before hauling her to her feet and marching her toward the property boundary. The whole sequence would last less than 90 seconds on screen, but those 90 seconds had required hours of preparation and conversation. The first take was technically perfect but emotionally hollow. Cole and Tanaya both felt it, that absence of authentic emotion that would make the scene feel staged rather than real. Taylor Sheridan called cut and gathered everyone. For a moment, he reminded them that this wasn't about action choreography, it was about 2 people caught in circumstances larger than themselves, about systematic oppression and inherited conflict, about what happens when individual humans become representatives of historical trauma. He asked Cole to remember that Rip was acting out of fear disguised as aggression, that his violence came from a desperate need to protect the only family he had ever known. He asked Tanaya to tap into the exhaustion of being seen as a threat simply for existing, for walking on land that her ancestors had known intimately long before it became Dutton property. The second take captured something raw and difficult to watch. Cole's face showed not triumph but a kind of grim resignation as he grabbed Tanaya's arm, his jaw clenched against words he couldn't or wouldn't say. Tanaya's initial surprise gave way to defiant anger, her eyes meeting his with an accusation that needed no dialogue. When they fell into the snow, the camera lingered on the moment of stillness before Cole pulled her up, and in that pause, both characters seemed to recognize the futility of their struggle. They were both prisoners of a story that had been written long before either of them arrived, acting out roles that history had assigned to them. When Cole finally released her at the property line, pointing for her to leave, Tanaya delivered a look over her shoulder that conveyed more than pages of dialogue could have. A mixture of contempt, pity, and weary understanding that this cycle would continue long after both of them were gone. Taylor Sheridan called cut and the set remained silent for several long seconds. The crew had witnessed something that transcended typical television production, a moment that felt uncomfortably real despite the cameras and the controlled environment. Hauser walked away from the scene without his usual professional composure, his hands shaking slightly as he processed what they had just created. Tanaya stood at the property boundary marker, still in character, her chest heaving with breath that was only partially from physical exertion. The emotional weight of what they had portrayed hung heavy over everyone present, and the usual immediate discussion of whether another take was needed didn't come. Everyone instinctively understood that what they had captured couldn't be improved or replicated. It simply was, in all its disturbing complexity. The editing process for this scene became its own battlefield of competing visions. The network executives who saw the first cut expressed immediate concern about audience reaction. Focus groups had consistently shown that Rip Wheeler was the show's most beloved character, and this scene threatened to alienate the very fans who drove Yellowstone's massive ratings. They suggested cutting the scene shorter, adding music to soften its impact, including dialogue that would better justify Rip's actions. Taylor Sheridan refused every suggestion, understanding that diluting the scene would destroy its purpose. The discomfort it created was the point, not a problem to be solved. He argued passionately that audiences were intelligent enough to wrestle with complexity, that treating them like children who needed heroes without blemishes was an insult to both the viewers and the craft of storytelling. Hauser found himself in the unusual position of defending a scene that portrayed his character in such a harsh light. During interviews leading up to the episode's air date, he carefully navigated questions about the confrontation, trying to provide context without excusing Rip's actions. He spoke about the cycle of violence that the show explored, how hurt people often hurt others, how loyalty can become toxic when it demands unquestioning service. He talked about his own discomfort filming the scene, acknowledging that it forced him to access parts of masculine aggression that he worked hard to keep in check in his own life. But he also emphasized that good television should challenge viewers, should make them question their allegiances and examine their own complicity in systems of oppression. Rip Wheeler wasn't meant to be a role model, he was meant to be a mirror reflecting back the complicated reality of American masculinity and the violence it often required. Behind the scenes, Tanaya Beatty was conducting her own quiet campaign to ensure that her character's story didn't end with victimization. She worked with the writers to develop a backstory for the woman that would be revealed in later episodes, giving her name, family, motivations beyond simple trespassing. Her character became Singing Bird, a young woman whose grandmother had been forcibly removed from the land during the tribal relocations of the early 20th century. She had been walking the old paths that her grandmother described in stories, trying to maintain connection with a heritage that had been systematically erased. The trespassing wasn't defiance, it was remembrance. It was an act of cultural survival. When this context emerged in subsequent episodes, the scene with Rip took on additional layers of meaning, transforming from a simple property dispute into a microcosm of ongoing colonial violence. The episode aired on a Sunday night in November, and social media exploded with immediate reactions. Fans who had spent 4 seasons defending every one of Rip's violent acts found themselves unable to rationalize this one. The brutality was too visceral, the power imbalance too stark, the victim too sympathetic. Comment sections filled with arguments about whether the scene was necessary, whether it constituted character assassination, whether the show had finally crossed a line from gritty realism into gratuitous exploitation. Indigenous viewers and activists pointed out the problematic history of depicting Native women as victims without agency, questioning whether Yellowstone was critiquing colonial violence or simply reproducing it for entertainment. The debate raged for weeks, with think pieces appearing in major publications analyzing the scene from every possible angle. What many viewers didn't know was that this controversy was exactly what Taylor Sheridan had anticipated and, to some degree, orchestrated. He had grown frustrated with the way audiences had embraced the Dutton family's violence as righteous and justified, missing or ignoring the show's critique of their actions. By having Rip, the most sympathetic and beloved enforcer, commit an act of violence against someone who was clearly not a threat, Sheridan forced viewers to confront their own complicity in celebrating brutality when it came from characters they liked. The scene was a litmus test, revealing who was watching Yellowstone as a critique of power and who was watching it as a celebration of it. The controversy wasn't a mistake, it was the entire point. Cole Hauser received death threats from fans who felt betrayed by Rip's actions, as if the fictional character's choices reflected the actor's personal values. He also received messages from survivors of violence thanking him for portraying the ugliness of aggression without glamorizing it, for showing that violence damages everyone involved, even those who commit it. The dichotomy of responses revealed the intense parasocial relationships that audiences develop with television characters, the way fictional people can become repositories for our own values and desires. Rip Wheeler meant different things to different viewers, and this scene shattered comfortable interpretations, forcing everyone to see him more clearly. For Tanaya Beatty, the aftermath of the episode brought unexpected opportunities. Casting directors who had previously only considered her for stereotypical Native roles began offering more complex characters. Other Indigenous actors reached out to thank her for insisting on her character's backstory and refusing to be simply a prop in someone else's narrative arc. The scene, despite its disturbing content, had opened conversations about representation and agency that extended far beyond Yellowstone itself. She began speaking at film schools about the importance of actors advocating for their characters, especially when those characters come from marginalized communities. The violence her character experienced became a catalyst for discussing real-world violence against Indigenous women, an epidemic that receives far too little attention in mainstream media. Behind the scenes, the production team learned valuable lessons about consent and collaboration in filming difficult scenes. New protocols were established for any sequence involving physical conflict or potential trauma triggers, with actors given more input into how scenes were choreographed and shot. Mental health resources were made available on set, recognizing that portraying violence, even fictional violence, could have psychological impacts on everyone involved. The scene had pushed boundaries, and while the artistic result was powerful, it had also revealed gaps in how the industry approached actor safety and well-being. Taylor Sheridan, despite his reputation for demanding adherence to his vision, acknowledged that he could have handled the preparation for the scene better, could have involved the actors more deeply in discussions about its implications before the shooting day arrived. The relationship between Cole Hauser and Tanaya Beatty evolved through the experience into a mutual respect born from shared difficulty. They had created something together that neither could have achieved alone, something that transcended their individual performances to become a cultural touchstone. In later interviews, when they appeared together at press events, they spoke about the scene with a gravity that made clear it wasn't just another day at work. They had touched something real, had channeled historical trauma and contemporary tension into 90 seconds of television that would be analyzed and debated for years to come. Their professional partnership became an example of how actors could navigate difficult material with integrity, maintaining their own boundaries while serving the story's needs. As subsequent episodes revealed more of Singing Bird's background and showed Rip quietly struggling with what he had done, audiences began to understand the fuller picture that Taylor Sheridan had been painting. The scene wasn't meant to be viewed in isolation, it was a turning point in a larger narrative about the costs of loyalty and the violence required to maintain empires built on stolen land. Rip's character didn't become a villain, but he became more complicated, more human, less easy to romanticize. The uncomfortable truth was that good people sometimes do terrible things, and loving someone doesn't require excusing everything they do. The Dutton Ranch's survival depended on people like Rip being willing to commit violence on its behalf, and the show refused to let viewers celebrate that violence without also witnessing its human cost. The scene became a teaching tool in film schools and ethics classes, used to discuss everything from the male gaze in cinematography to the responsibilities of storytelling when depicting marginalized communities. Professors showed it alongside interviews with the actors and creators, asking students to analyze the gap between artistic intention and audience reception, to consider how context shapes meaning. The controversy it generated became as important as the scene itself, revealing how audiences bring their own biases and blind spots to their viewing experiences. Some saw it as essential social commentary, others saw it as exploitative shock value. The truth, as with most art that matters, probably lay somewhere in the complicated middle. Years after the episode aired, Cole Hauser would cite that scene as one of the most important of his career, not because it showcased his talent but because it challenged him to think beyond performance to purpose. He began selecting roles more carefully, asking questions about the messages his work sent into the world. Tanaya Beatty's career trajectory shifted toward more substantial roles, and she became an advocate for indigenous representation in film and television, using her growing platform to push for authentic casting and storytelling. The brief, brutal scene they shared became a catalyst for personal growth and professional evolution for both actors, proof that difficult art could change not just audiences but also the artists themselves. The truth behind that shocking moment was more complicated than any clickbait headline could capture. It wasn't about one actor's decision or one director's vision, but about a collision of historical trauma, artistic ambition, industry limitations, and the unpredictable ways that fiction can intersect with reality. The scene worked because everyone involved took it seriously, treated it as more than just another piece of action choreography or dramatic confrontation. They recognized that they were dealing with stories that had real-world resonance, that the violence they portrayed on screen echoed violence that indigenous women face every day. That recognition brought both pressure and responsibility, demanding more thoughtfulness and care than typical television production allowed. What happened behind the cameras was a master class in the complexity of creating art that matters, art that doesn't shy away from difficult truths even when they're uncomfortable to witness. The scene wasn't shocking because it depicted violence. Violence had been central to Yellowstone from its first episode. It was shocking because it forced beloved characters and comfortable audiences to confront the ugly reality of what maintaining power actually requires. It stripped away the romance of the cowboy mythology that the show both celebrated and critiqued, revealing the blood and tears upon which the American West was built. Rip Wheeler's actions weren't an aberration, they were the logical conclusion of the worldview the Duttons represented, and seeing it performed by a character audiences loved made it impossible to ignore. The scene endures because it refuses easy answers or comfortable resolutions. Years later, fans still debate whether it was necessary, whether it went too far, whether it crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. But perhaps that ongoing debate is the most important outcome, evidence that the scene accomplished its true purpose. It made people think, question, argue, and wrestle with complexity rather than passive consumption. In an era of television designed primarily for comfortable binge watching, Yellowstone dared to create a moment that stuck in viewers' minds long after the episode ended, that demanded more than just emotional reaction but actual intellectual and moral engagement. The truth behind the scene is that great storytelling sometimes requires making audiences uncomfortable, showing them things they'd rather not see, forcing confrontation with realities they'd prefer to ignore. That's not cruelty, that's respect for the intelligence and capacity of the audience to handle difficulty and emerge with deeper understanding. And in the end, isn't that what all meaningful art should do?